I've had many friends who've dropped out at mile 95, 97. Until you get to the finish line, you can't celebrate. Just pushing through and getting to the finish and, dying happily. My neurologist thought I was recovering for up to 6 months. When I told my neurologist, hey, I think I'm ready to go back to normal life again, he was like, shut the F up. You're not serious.
All right. Today on the podcast, we have Wookie Kim, a man of many talents, but among them, ultrarunner, legal director of the ACLU in Hawaii. To kick it off, I was scrolling through your Instagram late last night and I saw this post about the Speed Project 5.0, which is when you were part of a 6-person crew that ran from LA to Vegas, which is 341 miles, about 56 miles per person. And you guys did it at a 7-minute and 14-second per mile pace, which is crazy. And you said, we went out hard in our first legs and just kept going harder each successive time. With each leg, we dug deeper into the well and found more hidden pockets of energy. So I'm wondering, how do you dig deep into this well and find those hidden pockets of energy?
Ooh, how do I dig deep? That's sort of like an existential question, but I think with a lot of the ultra or the endurance events that I do, I think there's so much that's mental, and there's so much that when you're put in really tough situations, there's always a way to find more energy or more in the tank. And I think that's something that I've always enjoyed doing. I think from when I started playing sports in high school and realized that I was good at emptying the tank. But to me, it's all in your head, right? There are certain physical limitations based on your, body type or your genetics. But at the end of the day, to accomplish these really difficult endurance feats, it's all about mindset, and it's all about your mental capacity. And that's part of the reason why I love events like the Speed Project or experiences like the Speed Project. And I'm actually exactly 2 weeks away from the next Speed Project. It's the 10th anniversary year, and it's going to be the biggest and best race yet. And really excited to be bringing another team of Hawaii-based runners out to the desert and seeing what we can do this year. We have a different strategy, different race plan, but definitely will involve emptying the tank again.
That's interesting. Can you break down the strategy when you try to plot out a run from city to city, state to state? Like, what does that strategy look like, and what are you thinking about?
Well, so for this race is kind of unique in that there are really only a couple rules. One of the rules is you just start at point A, which is the Santa Monica Pier, and then get to point B, which is the welcome sign in Las Vegas. And so teams have complete discretion to use whatever route they want to get from point A to point B, but only one runner is allowed to be running at any given point in time. And so over the years, there have been a lot of creative pacing strategies. I think the most traditional strategy is to, have each runner start out with longer legs of, 6 miles or 10K legs, go through that a couple times, then drop down to 5K legs, go through that a couple times, and then drop down to 2 1.5 mile legs. And then for the last 100 miles or so, basically alternating every mile or even half mile. So that's sort of the traditional strategy. But one year, a few years ago, the record-breaking team, they decided to run 90-second legs. Basically, a pair of runners would go out. One runner would be on a bicycle. The other runner would be basically sprinting for 90 seconds. At the end of that 90 seconds, they would switch and they'd alternate back and forth for, 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And then the next pair would hop in. But that team averaged, I think, 5:15 pace for 340 miles, which is absolutely mind-blowing. This race, you could have one runner just run 100 miles straight, but obviously you wouldn't be able to run very fast. There is now a solo division. So there's, every year, there are more and more people going out and starting Monday or Tuesday of race week and spending 4 or 5 days running that 340-mile distance. And it's incredible to experience, to sort of like witness what they're doing as well.
So with the race ending in Vegas, that is home to many amazing restaurants and buffets. So do you guys have a post-race celebration planned at like one of the best buffets?
No, because the 2 times that I've done it before, we've finished right after sunset, and then it's a very long, arduous process of checking into the hotel. By that point, we've been, up for 48 hours straight, or, so we're exhausted, and surprisingly, it's actually very hard to get places if you're unwilling to walk very far, because these casinos are massive complexes, and when you're fully rested, it's easy to walk half a mile through the complex, but when your legs are dead, it's kind of difficult. So we haven't really ever done that, but hopefully this year we're taking a new route. We're gonna shortcut a little bit through parts of the desert and go off-road, and that will hopefully cut 40 miles. That's become almost the standard route that a lot of the teams use. 3 or 4 years ago, a team sort of found this access road that goes along these power lines. It's actually called Power Lines Road. And it was a shortcut involving sort of dirt roads. But when you're cutting 40 miles, that it's better to run on dirt than on pavement. But yeah, we'll see. This year, hopefully, we'll finish before, our target is to finish before sunset on the second day. And that would be amazing to get to the welcome sign while the sun is still in the sky.
I love that you've turned a very individual sport into a team effort. Could you paint a bit more of the picture of what everyone else is doing while the one person is leading the distances? Like, I guess in that one of the examples you gave, you have teams of 2. One guy's actually biking and so covering the mileage and in some way, shape, or form. But in your team, what's the rest of the team doing, and how are they contributing or resting when they're not running?
Yeah, so one of the signature features of this race is that most of the teams will rent large RVs to for their team. And so the rest of the team is usually in the RV resting and also stopping every, mile or so along the side of the road and hopping out and cheering on the runner. And so early on, it's fairly straightforward because the legs are longer. So there's more time between each runner exchange. But then later in the late stages of the race, when you're swapping out every quarter mile or half mile, the drivers are literally, the driving and the navigation and making sure where to stop, that can make or break the team's experience, right? Because if you screw up the handoff, or if you drive too far and the runner's too tired and slows down too soon, you're in trouble. So it's a true team effort. And even though we have 6 runners, we also have 4 crew. We have 4, support folks who will be driving, navigating, making sure that we're eating, cheering us on, pacing us for part of it. So it's a really fun experience, and that's why I do it every year, even though it is very painful.
You mentioned pain. I'm curious. I actually asked a very similar question to Colin Burns, who we had on the podcast. He's the guy that ran the Georgia Death Race. I'm curious, when you're thinking about what races or experiences to sign up for, what's the criteria that you're thinking about? Are you trying to push yourself? Are you thinking about what's the most memorable? What's the most fun? What place is going to have the best views? Like, what's your ranking in terms of all the events you could go to? Because like you just mentioned before we started recording, nowadays there's all these races. There's so many. So how do you decide which ones to actually do?
Yeah, I mean, I think my criteria have changed over the years. I think earlier on, maybe I wanted to prove myself a little bit more. Or I wanted to take on sort of the really hard, challenging races. I still like that, but I also, most of the 100-milers that I've done have been fairly difficult. So for example, the Hurt 100 here in Hawaii, it's sometimes considered one of the harder 100-milers even in the world. It really depends on the weather though. I think if it's dry like it was this year, the course isn't that bad, but there's 25,000 feet of climbing over that distance, so it's fairly significant. I've only done 400-miler, but each one of them has been fairly difficult. Hurt 100, and then Run Rabbit Run being another fairly challenging one. That's in Steamboat Springs, or in the mountains above Steamboat Springs. But it's both 22,000 feet of climbing, and it's mostly at elevation, which makes it that much more challenging. Basically, the way I look at it is I'm not someone who races 5, 10, 15, 20 times a year. When it comes to the 100-milers, I'm really looking at 1 or 2 races a year. And if I'm going to be doing this fairly seriously for my, for the middle portion of my life, I can only expect maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years more of that running. And so I really only have under 20 or 30 opportunities to do these races. And so lately I've been thinking more about using each race as an opportunity to explore the world and to see really beautiful places that I've not seen. So I'm less inclined to do the same race over again because it's using up that opportunity that could be spent exploring somewhere new. So for example, I just signed up a few weeks ago for the Samo 100. It's in the Santa Monica Mountains above Malibu. And I've never run in that area. And I know it's beautiful. And there are a lot of really epic trail races of shorter distances in those mountains. Why not give it a shot? And I haven't really spent that much time in and around Malibu. So I'm making it sort of a 5-day vacation. And the center of that vacation will be the 100-miler. So, but I think about exploring the world. I like feeling a sense of adventure. So I don't like races that are just out and backs or loops that you do, a 2-mile loop that you do 50 times. That's not really my thing. I like point-to-point courses in really beautiful, rugged terrain.
Speaking of the Hurt 100, I saw this video on your Instagram as I don't know who's recording it, but it's as you finish the race. And in the beginning of the video, you're still running across the finish line and you look completely normal, like you're dialed in, you're running. It almost feels like you don't know where you are, and then you realize that you finished the race, and then all the emotions come flooding in, like tears flowing, and it seems like you're a little even disoriented, like you ran into the sign and then you realize like, oh, I should ring the bell. Can you walk us through what was going on there and what was that emotional transition like?
Yeah, I guess when those moments when you cross the finish line, they're sort of unbelievable moments because you've just accomplished what you didn't think was really even possible. Every time, I consider myself a fairly experienced ultra runner now, and I've done a fair number of ultras, but it doesn't matter. Every time you cross the finish line, it is a huge success because there's never any guarantee that you're going to finish. And in fact, I just had my first DNF last summer, and Matt, you may know a little bit about what happened, but it ended in disaster where I had to be rescued and I was seizing and I went unconscious and I thought I was going to die. And the people that I was with also thought that, I was in really, really bad shape. And so that was tough. But so those moments when you do reach the finish, and especially with the Hurt 100, which is my home race. In fact, I'm looking out my window, I can see the mountain where the race is held. And so knowing that this was my second 100, by the way. So it being my second 100, my first 100 after moving to Hawaii, and having run and supported so many of the local runners over that previous year, it was just such a emotional culmination, right? And to finally hit the finish line or ring the bell, and it just sort of all the emotions kind of flood in, and it's like you can't let those emotions impact you until you get to the finish, because otherwise you risk psyching yourself out, right? You never want to celebrate prematurely because things can go wrong in the last 2 miles of a race. And I've had many friends who've dropped out at mile 95, 97. Until you get to the finish line, you can't celebrate.
I think what's been really interesting for me listening to endurance athletes is hearing about what's going on in their psyche throughout different parts of the race. It's almost like different chapters, and you can be experiencing completely separate feelings and emotions physically and mentally. I'm curious, specifically maybe for your very first 100-miler, like if you could walk us through the phases and what you experienced from beginning to the finish line.
Yeah. So There's a common saying in the ultra community that a 100 miler is life in a day, right? You start out, you're really energetic, you're sort of irrational, you're going way too fast, but when you're young, right, or early in your life, that's how you live, right? You don't think about the consequences. You don't think about what's going to happen to you 10 years later on. And that's exactly what running most hundreds are like, because you start out way too fast and you're overconfident. You're taking risks that you shouldn't be taking. And then as you get to the middle of the race, you're like, oh God, this is way harder. I really need to be more rational. I need to be more strategic, right? And then so you sort of start to slow down. And then in the sort of third quarter of the race, that's where shit's going bad. You're questioning your life choices. This is like your midlife crisis, right? You're slowing down. You're realizing your body isn't capable of doing what you thought it was capable of doing. And then you get to the end and, it's all about just pushing through and getting to the finish and, dying happily, right? So that's sort of like the general flow of each race. And I got in the habit, I don't know if you saw any of these videos, but the last few major races that I've done, I've tried to do a selfie video every mile in the race. And that really, the one that I did from Run Rabbit Run back in 2019, that really shows you the ups and downs of ultra running, because, for the first 30, 40 miles, I was smiling, I was laughing, I was joking. I was like, oh, I'm going to break my PR, like, super confident. And then, 40 to 60, I'm just sort of emotionless, but determined. And then 60 to 80, it's F-bombs, constant F-bombs, and then, yeah, so it really is something to see all the different emotions you can feel in the span of a day or a single race. And I think that's part of what makes the 100-mile distance so fun, is that it's long enough that you really are forced into experiencing this whole range of emotions that a marathon, you can't feel that. I don't think I'm ever going to go beyond the 100-mile distance, because I also recognize how much sacrifice, and both in terms of time and energy, that it takes to do these kinds of things. But I feel like 100-miler is a really authentic, meaningful, rewarding experience for me, at least given where I am. And I really have a lot to learn from it, and I want to keep trying to crack the code, or to figure it out, because I still, even though I've had some good races, there hasn't been one that I've been like, damn, I nailed it, right? And so that's sort of what I'm always looking to do.
What determines a good race in your own view? Is it purely time to complete, or is it like matching your expectations, lack of injury, how quickly you recover? What determines a good race for you?
That's a good question. Again, I think that has shifted over the years. These days, it's more process oriented, or more how it felt, right? That I felt like I exerted myself close to or at my limit, and I did so sort of without exceeding it, right? Like I want to be as close to the limit as possible without exceeding it, because exceeding it will mean failure, will mean injury, will mean bonking, will mean, right? So it's like any race where I feel like I ran optimally is one that is going to have me satisfied. And it's oftentimes that does coincide with a fast time, but not necessarily. So, but of course, for every race, I do have some rough time goals. And usually, like many athletes, I set an A goal, a B goal, and sort of like a C goal, like, no matter what, I'm going to hit this. And my A goals are usually very aggressive, but it's also with the recognition that when the stars align, you really can do incredible things that are far beyond what you even thought was possible. And there have been moments in my racing career where I have hit those A goals, and those are really, really fun moments. Yeah.
So when you set these goals, how much are you competing against yourself and these standards you set for yourself? And how much do you look out towards the community at the best in the world, the best at these races, when you set the goals for yourself? I think it's really easy to compare in some instances, but this is such a niche, small community. I'm just curious how that's impacted the way that you look at your performance in relation to everybody else.
You know, of course, it's impossible to ignore comparisons or to ignore how others are doing. And certainly when I toe the start line, I am thinking about my competition and, I want to do well. But at the end of the day, I do this for me, and really my prime competitor is myself, right? And doing better than my past self. And so that's my primary goal. And oftentimes that benefits me. I think the moments where I've raced and I've only focused on how I can do and not how I do in relation to others, those are the races where I've succeeded the most, because when I'm focused on others, I usually end up not pacing myself correctly. I end up going out too hard, and then I end up crashing in the second half of the race. And I've done that way too many times now. The races where I felt like I was in the best shape of my life and ready to set PRs or do really well often end up being the worst performances, because I've psyched myself up too much and I've gone out too hard, and then I crash and burn. And it's the races where I don't have any real serious expectations that I've done the best. And I guess I just need to channel, right? I just need to always remember that and not think about others. But I am fairly good at letting other people go, often in the middle of the pack for the first third of a race. And then I work my way up in the second half, because I just fatigue less, or, my pace drops less than all those people who went out way too hard. So I know that I'll never be able to get to the level of, people who do this full time. That's something also that I'm thinking about, right? That it's okay. Like I don't need to compare myself to the top. I just need to compare myself to me, and then otherwise to, people who are also in similarly situated people.
Yeah, you mentioned that a good race is when you are close to the limit, but you don't hit the limit, because hitting the limit would mean not finishing or getting injured. As part of that attitude and that just general ambition, sometimes you do hit the limit or go over the limit. And from getting to know you over the last few months, I've heard the stories. I think you've had at least 2 near-death situations. Hopefully only 2, or at least only 2 that I know. So I'm sure you knew that this was coming.
I mean, these are very, very long stories, but the basic point is that the Aspen incident in 2016, I was doing a single day adventure run of the 4-pass loop, which is it's a bucket list trail outside of Aspen in the Maroon Bells wilderness. And I was with a friend. We were doing it as a single day run. It's about 26 miles, 25 miles, but it involves 4 mountain passes at about 12,500 feet. At the time, I was living at sea level in DC. And long story short, in the worst possible location, which is in the valley between the second and the third pass, I realized that my altitude sickness was really, really serious. It was beyond just a headache. It was so painful that I had trouble even like staying on my feet. And that's when we had to make a decision about what to do. But unfortunately, you can't just get off the trail right there. And the only way out of that area was to either keep going and climb over 2 more mountain passes and finish the loop, or just turn around and go back over the 2 passes. That took many, many hours, and my condition deteriorated rapidly, where I lost my vision. I then lost my balance, and eventually I went unconscious. And that's when my friend found 3 backpackers who were starting in the opposite direction. And they stayed with my unconscious body while my friend ran back to the trailhead and called the sheriff and gave them an update. And Mountain Rescue Aspen, launched a rescue team. And as soon as the advanced team came out with the team doctor and they took my vitals, they realized that I only had a few more hours left on the mountain. And so they called in a nighttime helicopter extraction, because originally their plan was to get to my body, stabilize me, give me oxygen, put me, keep me warm, and then at sunrise, at daybreak, extract me off the mountain by foot, right? Because obviously you don't want to resort to helicopter rescue as a first resort, and especially nighttime up there where it's really, it's fairly dangerous to do rescues at night in that area. But they felt they didn't have any choice given how critical my condition was. And so I was in a coma for several days, and I woke up in the hospital in the ICU in Denver because none of the hospitals, in near Aspen had the equipment to handle my condition. So they had to fly me all the way to Denver, and I recovered there for a couple weeks. And yeah, that was that story.
What was their diagnosis, and what did they tell you after you sort of recovered and woke up?
Yeah, so I had high altitude cerebral edema, high altitude pulmonary edema, and severe hyponatremia. So I think my blood sodium level was at 118, which is extremely, extremely low. But I was having seizures. I wasn't even conscious for a lot of this portion. And, cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, those are the things that kill people who are trying to summit Everest. So what was very unusual in my situation was that, I had one of the top altitude neurologists who treated me in the hospital in Denver. And he said my case was so unusual because they don't really see cerebral or pulmonary edema at 12,000 or 13,000 feet. It's really at 16,000 plus feet that people get those conditions. But of course it happens, and I'm one of the rare cases where it happened. And so it was a little bit of a fluke. And obviously there are a lot of factors that contributed to it, including the fact that I lived at sea level. I flew right into Aspen, which is at almost 9,000 feet, and only acclimated or whatever for 2 nights before we did the run. I was under a lot of stress at the time when preparing for trial in a case, and this was like one of those long weekend getaways that I had planned with one of my really good friends. So it was just a combination of factors. The doctors couldn't really identify. They couldn't say that there was a single root cause of what happened, but given all the circumstances, each contributed in a small way to making me more susceptible to, getting these really serious conditions. But
coming out of the coma in Denver, I'm sure there's a lot of disorientation. You're like trying to figure out what's going on. Can you walk us through those next few days? Like, I imagine you're pretty shaken up. And how did you end up regaining your sense of confidence to, I guess, first even go for a run and then eventually work yourself back to where you are right now?
Yeah, I had a miraculous recovery, both, I thought it was miraculous, but also my neurologist thought it was miraculous that I recovered so quickly. But in short, this happened in July of 2016, and December 2016 was when I did my first 100-mile race. So I went from having had memory loss, basically being immobile. I needed an assistant to even go to the bathroom to pee. And basically they were like wheeling me around in a wheelchair and helping me like sit on the toilet bowl. I went from that, and of course being in a coma and wake. So I remember two things early on. One was I was half conscious. I felt like I was in a dream, and I felt like I was drowning. And apparently it was because I was intubated and I was regaining consciousness. But all I remember is I felt like I was drowning. I woke up, but I couldn't use my hands because they had tied them up. Because apparently I was, semi-consciously trying to yank the intubation tube out of my throat or whatever. Does it go into the esophagus? No, not the esophagus. I guess it goes into your larynx, whatever, right? It goes down through your neck, into your mouth, and down through your neck. But that was one moment, and then I think I went unconscious again after that. But then when I finally regained full consciousness, I just remember seeing my mom's face. It's sort of like that stereotypical scene in a movie where it's like the silhouette of the face and the sky around. It was like that, and my mom's face was there, and I was like, why? And I sort of looked around like, where am I? What day is it? what's going on? And why are you here? But the early days were really tough because I guess I didn't, tough just because I was just so disoriented and, I had memory loss. I could not remember my password to my laptop. So I couldn't even use my computer for a few days. I don't even remember how I regained my memory, but every day they would ask the doctors would ask me questions like, who's the president right now? And, how many fingers am I holding up? That kind of thing. But so it took a lot of therapy, physical and occupational therapy, that kind of thing. But yeah, my neurologist thought I was going to be resting, recovering for up to 6 months. And I was back at work in a month and a half after I was discharged from the hospital. In fact, when I told my neurologist, who was based in Denver, I called him up and said, hey, I think I'm ready to go back to normal life again. He was like, shut the F up. You're not serious. I'm not letting you go unless you get a second opinion. Go see this neurologist and get your MRI from her. So I did. And my results were perfect. It was like, she said that it was as if nothing had happened to my brain. And so I got the clearance to go back to work. And by that point, I was already starting to try and spend a little bit more time moving my body, because for the first 2-3 weeks after being discharged from the hospital, I basically was I was just sleeping. I slept 18 hours a day. I slept for 12 hours straight. And then I would just nap every hour for 90 minutes. So I'd wake up, eat something, nap, daydream. At that time, I was still so disoriented and messed up that I couldn't even watch Netflix. I couldn't even focus on a computer screen. And so I literally spent those early days, that first week out of the hospital, just staring out the window at the clouds. It's like summer in DC. Thankfully, I had air conditioning in my apartment, but I just remember sitting on the couch, just vegging and looking out in the clouds. I don't know exactly how far out it was, but maybe a month into it, I felt good enough to start going on walks. And so I try and walk for 30 minutes every day. And then 6 weeks out, I got on the treadmill, and I would do 1 mile at 15 minute pace, which is just incredibly slow for me. I can't even run that slow if I'm running flat, because it's so, that's like walking. It's like walking, right? It's like speed walking. But I started out at 15-minute mile pace back in, August or late August or early September. And then all of a sudden, I could do 2 miles, and then I could do 3 miles, and then I could do 3 miles at 10-minute pace. And by, October, I was almost, feeling like a normal runner again. And so I think I had already signed up for this 100-miler. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to train for it. Might as well. And it was my first 100, and I did it in December of that year. So absolutely. I mean, it's mind blowing to me, but also my doctors just thought I was, a freak of nature.
Without the MRI, the records, the hospital records, your story, it just seems like so surreal that something like this could even happen. You could be in a coma 1 month, and then the next month later be running 100 miles. But first of all, what age were you at that point?
I was 30. So it was 2016. I was born in 86. So yeah, I was 30. Yeah, I mean, my body was under a lot of stress that year, because not only had I just gone through that really harrowing and traumatic experience in July, but I was a second-year associate at this law firm in DC, and I was grinding. I mean, I've never worked that many hours on anything. And so it's kind of, I don't know. I don't know how I made it through those years, but Matt knows this. Abe, you don't. But that near-death incident, completely changed my, I guess, life trajectory. And one of the things that I was thinking about while I was recovering and staring out at the clouds for hours every day was how to make my transition away from corporate litigation and to the area of law that I really wanted to be in, which was to be a civil rights lawyer. It was really at that moment that I started the job search to make that transition. And it took a year and a half, But eventually well, it took about a year because I interviewed for the ACLU of Hawaii job in July of 2017. And then my start date at the ACLU of Hawaii here in Honolulu, was in early February 2018. But all of that, basically, I made a decision that I didn't want to wait until tomorrow to do the things that I wanted to do today. And, I think for a lot of my life, I'd been always planning ahead, always planning for the future. I decided, having nearly died, you just can't wait. You can't put things off because you don't know if you're going to be here tomorrow. That's such a trite saying, but I felt it, right? I experienced that firsthand, and it became so important, and that's dramatically influenced how I live my life just in general. And so I think I mentioned this before we started, but that's one of the reasons why it sounds sort of sick to say this, but I'm almost grateful for that experience. And probably I can only say that because I got away without any permanent brain damage, right? Because one of the common long-term outcomes of getting cerebral edema is you have significant memory loss, or, your cognitive capacity is affected. And as far as I knew, there was no long-term impact from the incident. And so maybe I'd feel a little bit differently. Maybe I wouldn't see this as a net positive event in my life if I had really serious cognitive problems. That's why I'm here in Hawaii.
This is a natural transition into another very important part of your life, which is your career. I guess at some point with this near-death situation, you have some sort of wake-up moment where you're like, I should do something more meaningful with my career. And so you aligned yourself with the mission of the ACLU.
And if you don't mind, just for everyone viewing, just describing the role of legal director and also ACLU, what does that stand for and what does that represent?
So the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. So it's a national organization that was started in 1918 in the post-World War I era. And essentially, we protect people's civil rights and civil liberties. And back in the post-war era, there was a fear of communists, and so a lot of people were persecuted, and a group of lawyers stood up for people who were accused of being traitors and whose rights had been violated. And over the years, the ACLU represented a lot of different marginalized groups, including, unions, people of color. And so a lot of the many significant constitutional rights and civil rights decisions have come out of ACLU cases. And so even, for example, when you think about Miranda rights, the ACLU had a role in that case in ensuring that, that police, when you're arrested, that they read you your rights. So it's a national organization. We work on a whole bunch of issues, immigrants' rights, legal reform, LGBTQ rights. And so I'm at the ACLU of Hawaii, which is our, Hawaii-based affiliate. I'm the legal director, which means that I run the legal program here. Right now, our 3 priority issue areas are decriminalizing poverty, smart justice, which is about addressing mass incarceration, and reimagining policing, which is about reimagining the role of police in our society. And so we have a variety of lawsuits in each of those areas. We are challenging various municipal ordinances and practices of criminalizing people who are houseless. And we have several lawsuits against police departments for police misconduct. So yeah, that's what I do. And the ACLU has always been a dream organization of mine. And so to be leading the legal program in Hawaii it's a true honor. And I really can't imagine anything better. It's kind of funny because I think for most of my life, there's always been something else that I've wanted to, something that I want to work towards. But I've reached this point where I don't want to do anything else. This is my dream job, and at least for now. But I also recognize that perspectives change over the years, and what seems like a dream today might not be a dream tomorrow. And so I recognize there's room for change and room for growth. But this is the first time in my life where I thought to myself, this is where I want to be. And there's literally nothing else that I'd want to do more. So that's kind of a good, I don't know, kind of a good and lucky position to be in, because I obviously recognize that it's hard to reach that point of whatever you want to call it, satisfaction or contentment, that you're not looking for, you're not trying to get some other job or make more money or whatever it is. I've sort of reached that stage right now in my life, and I'm grateful for that.
You mentioned the first one was just mass incarceration. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing your angle around what we could be doing better, and if there's like points of view in cases that you're trying to shift, and how that's going to hopefully make durable changes in at least Hawaii or the US.
At the outset, we have a mass incarceration problem here in the United States. Our rate of incarcerating people is the highest of any country in the world. And that really tells you something about the way our system works. And essentially, we have a system that focuses much more on punishment rather than rehabilitation. The impact of our system disproportionately falls on people of color, and Black and brown people in particular. How that materializes here in Hawaii is that you have way overcrowded jails and prisons. We had written a complaint to the U.S. Department of Justice a few years ago, focusing on the overcrowded conditions and how that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment that's prohibited by the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. What you have is jails and prisons that have a capacity of, a design capacity of, let's say, 1,000 people, but the system has crammed 1,500 people or 1,800 people into those facilities. Cells that are designed for 2 people have 3 or even 4 people in them. And it's because we as a society have an impulse to criminalize everything, to use punishment as our solution to what often are social problems. And so we're always looking for ways to rethink what our criminal legal system looks like. One of the areas that we're working on right now is bail reform, and thinking about ways where, we can be smarter about whose liberty is taken away before trial. In our system, there's a presumption of innocence, yet the way our system works is that when you're accused of a crime, for the most part, unless you have a lot of money, you're stuck behind bars. And it's a really unfair system, because people with money, people with means, are usually able to post their bail amounts, and so are able to be free pre-trial, even if they absolutely definitively committed the crime at issue. It's people who don't have money, people who are in poverty, who end up suffering from this cruel system.
It sounds like you think there's like not as much, it's not like we should expand our system to accommodate people better, but it's more about analyzing why people are in there in the first place. I'm curious, what are some of the causes that you think we should re-examine?
The impact of being detained pre-trial is immediately harmful, right? Because even 1 or 2 days of being held in jail can lead to a serious downward spiral for your life. Imagine, right, you have a job, you have a kid, or you have children, right? And all of a sudden, you get arrested and you get thrown in jail and you're not able to post bail. What happens in that 48-hour span? You haven't shown up for work. Your children, maybe the state decides that you are a neglectful parent and decides to take your child. So there are all these consequences that start accruing very soon after you're put in jail, right? Because once you're in jail, you have no ability to take care of your daily life. And I think that's something that people don't realize, the just how much of a difference it makes to be held in jail pre-trial versus to be free pre-trial. But that's another problem with our bail system, which is that we use bail as a form of punishment, we use pre-trial detention as a form of punishment when bail, the original purpose of bail was only to ensure that people show up for their court dates. The idea was back in like the medieval times, you had a surety, someone who would guarantee your appearance in court. So back in the day, it would be, your neighbor or your relative who would say, I promise that this person who is accused of a crime will show up for the next court date. But over the years and over the generations, money became the thing that you sort of put up as collateral. I'm putting up my money to prove to you that I'm going to show up in court. But today, in the 21st century, the money bail amount is used to detain people. In other words, judges will say, you know what, this person is dangerous. This person committed a dangerous crime. So I'm going to set bail at $500,000, even though I know that this person is houseless and has barely any income. And so because they can't afford that amount, they're stuck in jail pretrial. And it's not, and that's not how our system is supposed to work. So the basic problem is that how our system uses bail, implements bail practices has gone completely off the rails and has become, unfortunately, a form of punishment in itself. But unfortunately, too, that's also what many members of the community want, right? Because there's also the tension, right? And one of the purposes of detaining someone pretrial is to incapacitate them, to prevent them from committing other crimes. But we just think that, or I just think that the balance is too far on the side of detaining people pretrial, where we don't realize how much harm that does to everyone. Because also, when people are incarcerated, again, because we don't have a rehabilitative system, people come out worse, right? They don't come out rehabilitated. They come out in even more desperate situations, even more traumatized. And what does that lead to? Potentially more crime, right? And so our system is it's just very messed up, very messed up.
If you could imagine an ideal system, given the current situation, maybe just in Hawaii, I'm curious, like, what are some broad sweeping or maybe even specific improvements that you think might be able to help the situation out, whether it's lowering cash bail, removing it altogether? And yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So the Supreme Court many years ago said that in our system, pretrial detention is the exception, liberty is the norm, and pretrial detention is the carefully limited exception. And so anything that would sort of breathe life into that principle is what I'd want to see. Mm. And one way to do that, right, is to put the burden on the prosecutors to show that a specific individual is actually posing serious risk of harm to another individual, right? So say someone was accused of domestic violence, of, beating up his wife, right? In those situations, if the prosecutor can show that, yes, there's a credible possibility that this person, if he is allowed to be free pre-trial, that he might actually go and, shoot his wife, then it would be okay, right, to detain that person pre-trial. But for the vast majority of cases, and who are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this system or the harm of the system? It's poor people, right? People who are accused of petty crimes. And, there are houseless people who are cycling in and out of the system. For example, here in Hawaii, it's illegal to be in a park after hours, right? So you get a park closure citation. You get a citation for having an unpermitted structure in the park, putting the burden on the prosecutor to actually prove that someone should not be free pre-trial would be a huge change. And in fact, there's legislation that's moving through the legislature right now that would sort of that would actually ensure that the burden is on the right party. It's on the prosecutor to show that someone should be detained, rather than almost a de facto presumption that people are detained unless they have the money to pay themselves, bail themselves out, or there's some exceptional circumstances. So that's like one very concrete thing that would dramatically right size or put the system back on a better path.
When I look at the ACLU website, the organization describes itself as nonpartisan. And then when I look at the issues that the ACLU is fighting for, they seem to me, as someone who's, not an expert, they seem progressive leaning. I'm not saying I'm against this or any of my political beliefs, but do you agree with like the statement that the ACLU is nonpartisan?
So I think there's a difference between partisanship and sort of, whether or not the organization is progressive. I would just personally, I view the ACLU as a progressive organization, but it is still nonpartisan in the sense that we do not endorse any political candidates or any political parties. And that's something that's like a line in the sand that we won't cross. We had many lawsuits against the Trump administration. We have probably just as many against the Biden administration. We had just as many against the Obama administration. But I think from my personal standpoint, I think it's hard not to view the ACLU as at least somewhat or very progressive. I mean, I think if you just look at the positions that we take, I don't think you'll find many people at the ACLU who'll say, "Oh, we're just directly in the center of the political spectrum," right? That's just not true in my view. Again, I'm not speaking officially on behalf of the organization, but that's just my personal perspective. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that because again, we do represent people, quote unquote, on all sides of the spectrum. For example, in recent years, and actually that's one of the foundational principles that the ACLU was founded on, right, was to defend the rights of all people, right, regardless of their views. And that led to a lot of controversy, including back in the day when there were neo-Nazis who were protesting or doing a march, and the ACLU decided to represent them, and that led to a lot of controversy. And even more recently, we filed an amicus brief in defense of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, because of the fact that we were concerned that the Democrat Attorney General in New York was illegitimately singling out the NRA's nonprofit status, sort of as retaliation. So, depending on the issue, we will represent. It doesn't matter, what your political views are. We may represent you.
Yeah, I'm curious about community and what it means to you, because you're part of the running community. And I actually have seen you running around Ala Moana with a group of people, and you were telling me how you help people with races, and you did some laps on Coco Head with that guy that did Coco Head like 20 times in a row. And so you're part of this
40.
running community. Oh, 40. Shit. Okay. So you're part of this running community, and I think of like community as like concentric circles. So you're part of this running community, but also in Hawaii, I feel like community is emphasized, and that's why I love Hawaii. And I'm not sure if I've ever told you this, but like I plan to live in Hawaii at some point, like settle down, raise a family in Hawaii. So community is a big part of the appeal. So I'm curious, how do you view community, how you value it, and how you kind of have like the running community, but you also have the sense of community in Hawaii, reinforcing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think community is really, really important. And I think I'm learning that more as I get older. I'm going to be 37 this year. So I don't know where that is in relation to you. I know you're in your 20s.
I'm 26.
How old are you again?
Right around there.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I've got a decade more than you both. But yeah, I mean, I think relationships matter so much. And I feel like I'm realizing that more as the years go on. And so community is part of that. And, feeling like you are part of a community or a set of communities is something that is really important, and is important for sort of like your own, both for like your health, but also for satisfaction and purpose and meaning, right? Because we are all social beings, right? And so having that sense of belonging within your community, however you define community, and you might have multiple definitions, or that may look that may look different depending on the situation is really, really important. And definitely I've found that running is one of the easy ways for me to build community with people, as it would be for any sort of hobby, passion, or, you know, whatever that you may have. It's just a lot easier to build community when you're doing some, you know, you have a shared interest or a shared bond. And for me, from the ultra running community, there's something special, right? And so I work to cultivate that here in Hawaii, and I'm part of a bunch of different sort of both formal running groups, but also sort of like informal groups who become friends. And I find that that's really, really valuable, even though I spend a lot of my time running and training solo. But I always make sure that, you know, at least once or twice a week, I'm running with others, running in community. And that leads to another point, which is that all of these races that I've done that have been so-called solo races are actually community and team efforts, because they're all the people both in the background or even on the course, right? Like my crew or my pacers who are supporting me and making sure that I'm able to cross the finish line. And so that's another, I think, underappreciated aspect of the sport, that you really do rely on the help of so many others around you. And that's why I'm always so impressed when there are 100-mile finishers who went there literally by themselves, without a crew, without a pacer, and they run the whole race just, you know, by themselves. That's just a whole nother level of impressiveness.
I was going to say, like, given another opportunity, I'd love to really, you know, pick your brains on policy and, you know, what you do and what is all going on. For me personally, it's so hard to, I just moved to New York City, so I'm trying to understand like the societal, the things happening, local politics, and, you know, the threads that really influence how a community or a city or a state even behaves. Might ramble a little bit, but I was like just reading a book called Family Properties, and it highlights how the ghettos or the projects in Chicago weren't necessarily caused by people, but more so the root cause is more like around systemic abuse of like actual housing and like the way that discriminatory mortgages were held. So that's not
like
what I wanted to say. Yeah. It's really cool. Yeah, redlining. It's just, you know, sometimes I feel like there's not enough education for people around, you know, how the fabric of society works and what, you know, issues they should be involved in. So it's really cool being able to hear from your perspective, like some of the stuff you're fighting for in Hawaii. So just want to say thanks for that.
Yeah.
Abe, you'll get a chance to dive into all the policy questions when we talk to Stanley. So you get a second chance.
Can't wait.
That's true. That's true.
Can't wait.
Stan will be a great guest.
Yeah, Abe, you'll enjoy talking to Stanley. He's a great speaker and has lots of opinions.
Yes, many opinions.
But yeah, Wookie, just wanted to say thanks again for coming on the podcast. I actually just looked at the date. It's March 11th. I'll be in Hawaii a month from now, and I know I texted you when I was asking you to come on the podcast. Yeah. I was like, can you come put me through a workout when I'm in Hawaii and kick my ass? And I actually feel like in order for me to even meet the minimum or like the easiest workout you do, I have to start training pretty hard right now. But it's hard because I look outside and like it's snowing, and I'm not sure how I can get out and go for a run. But I'm gonna get some runs in before I'm back. So just want to say thanks again, and I'm sure we'll catch up in person once I'm back in Hawaii. Yeah,
well, you should come out with our run club to do a workout.
How slow is the slowest runner?
End up pushing us in special ways. We had the last guest we had, Colin, who did a couple of like pretty extreme fitness endurance competitions. Did a competition called High Rocks. I've since signed up for that competition for competing.
Oh, is that partner race, obstacle race type thing?
They do have a partner app component to it, but you can do it solo as well. And it's about like, fitness. Yeah.
That looks fun. That looks cool.
Yeah. After that episode, Abe and I FaceTimed each other right after, and we're like, all right, so what's the physical thing that we're going to step up now? Because we can't really not change what we're doing after that epised.
That's funny.
So many 100-mile runners on this podcast before even becoming ultramarathon.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Just do a 50K trail race. Do that as a start. 50K trail.
I need to start with the half marathon, so I think that's the first step.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, cool. I'll see you soon, Matt. Definitely down to
Yeah.
hang.
Thanks a lot, Wookie. It's been great talking to you and hearing about both your running
Yeah.
life and your legal life.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Wookie.
thanks. Really
appreciate
nice
it.
meeting you, Abe. Good chatting, Matt, and see you all soon.
Yep. See ya. Bye.
All right.
See you later.
Happy Saturday.